Super. I hope the first thing I said came out, which is no point sending me a chat because my chat's not open. Please send them to Andrew if they're questions, and Paul if they're technology based. Andrew, I'll pause for questions. If you think it's important to interrupt, then go ahead. When I come to you for the questions, Andrew, just answer them if you want to, or bounce them to me at your discretion. So good evening, everyone. So tonight is part 2, as you can see. To some extent, it's a recap of the initial message, but we're going to go on from there to talk about the full message and to talk about the rhythm of the interaction that you set up with the controller. So you'll get that by the end of tonight. Also, you'll know what needs to be read back. And finally, we'll talk about the types of controller that you'll come across. So you will recognize this from last week. If it's not in your memory, then I suggest you put it in your memory, even though crib sheets are now going to be allowed. You're going to be a lot better off if it's in your memory. And let me just say something about this. One of the things that people are concerned about is how do you know what to call the station that you're calling? And there are various things I could say to that. First thing is, go on the frequency and listen in first, and then you'll probably get to hear what they're called. It'll also just tune you into the voice and the general cadence of that controller, which will help. It'll also give you a chance to write down the Q&H, which will help. So that's one idea, listen in first. But before you go anywhere, have a think who you're likely to call, and ask your friends, colleagues, who are the relevant people to call, what are their call signs. Flight guides such as Poolies or VFR guides tell you. And I think this stands for the Electronic Aeronautical Information Package. Well, I hope I got that right, someone will tell me if I haven't. Which is the official place where all the call signs, everything you could ever need to know and far, far more can be found. And if you Google that, as per the slide, and that's AISEAIP, and look at part 2, you'll find all the places you need. So there are lots of places you could find out the correct call sign for the control. I'm using control to mean any ground station. But above all, as was said last week, it doesn't really matter. So if you simply say Birmingham or Shobden, then that will do. And when they come back to you, they will tell you what their call sign is. Or if you want to have a go, then I suggest that you big them up rather than big them down. You don't want to call Humberside Radio, as I did once, because she didn't like it. So if in doubt, call them radar or some such thing. But seriously, the thing to do is call them their place name if you really can't find out. So you recognise the rest of that that format, that standard format, which you should commit to memory. So what are some of the typical requests? So this is not exhaustive, but here are some ideas. So you might ask to enter their zone, or you might ask to enter the air traffic ATZ to thermal. You might say request join, which means join the pattern to land. You might ask for a zone transit. The zone, by the way, is a piece of airspace from the surface upwards. A MATS penetration, so a military aerodrome traffic zone. Or, as we were doing last week, for a basic service, where I find off to go across the Oxford extended centre line, so I sometimes say basic service to cross the extended centre line. So let's just look at this one. I'm going to just leave you time just to read what's on the right-hand side of the page. So there's the Rissingtons on the west side of the map, Alp Hayford, disused airfields on the east, top right. There's the glider. Oxford app is Oxford approach. Oxford approach. And you can choose the level. Level is a generic term to mean height, altitude, or flight level. With the cross country, we're always talking to controllers in altitude terms. And there's the QNH. So I'm going to say to you, write, just as you like, but I'm going to say, write out your initial message. That'll be my suggestion, and I'll pause to give you a chance to do that. Just to go forward one slide and come back. So you should know the format, and you can write in the words there. Probably enough time. And that's what you should have written down. So one of the, I'm going to suggest to you one of the key bits of learning that I've discovered is this, that when training people, I kind of, in the old days, I'd go around the classroom and say, okay, do your initial message, and then you'd watch people, they'd sit back in the chair and relax. That's really a mistake, because once you've transmitted your initial message, what you're saying really is that I'm ready for this next interaction, because certain things are going to happen now. As soon as you successfully transmit that initial message, the controller is going to say a few words, including pass your message. And that's your cue to transmit your full message, which is the second format I'm going to say to you, you need to learn. It doesn't end there, as you can see, because they're going to talk back to you. And the final step is you're going to read back those things that need to be read back. So let me just restate that, because I don't think it can be said enough. Don't transmit your initial message without being mentally prepared for these next 4 steps. So again, invite you to write out your full message for this out return cross country in Little Rissington to Upper Haven. So you've spoken to Oxford Approach and they've said, blah, 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 pass your message. Same thing. You should know the format on the left-hand side, ideally know it, but you could have it on your knee pad, you could have it on your desk in a test these days. I believe that's going to be the new rule. And fill in the right-hand bits. And I'm hoping you've got something like that. If you haven't, for some reason, there's something puzzling about that, then either put in a question to Andrew or save it for your coach. For the really eagle-eyed, Paul said last week, you don't need to say your flight conditions, which is the VFR, unless you're going through a zone transit, and I believe that's completely correct. I think I would say it's perfectly fine to, as a routine, say VFR tracking 2, and then name your next turning point. In gliding, remember, it's no good giving them some BGA point. Give them something that they will recognise, and I think the general advice is something that anyone can find on a 1/2 mil map. So VFR tracking 2 is a good way to end the call. There's no need.
Tuner, may I ask a question?
Yeah, please do.
Last week we were told to give your altitude or your height as altitude 2,600 QNH. blah, blah, blah? Is it just enough to give the QNH and then they know?
I think the Cat 413, I think if you're asking me, do you say the words QNH or do you say the actual number?
Do you say altitude 2,600?
Oh, no, no, I don't, let me, 2,600, no, I'd say 2,600 feet, 1017. I think what was said last week, forgive me, I can't do three screens, so I'm not quite sure who I'm speaking to, pardon me. I think what was said last week is that if a controller says descend, the controller wouldn't say descend to 2,500 feet, because that might sound descend to TO 500 feet, which could be bad news if the ground is at 600 feet. So a controller will say descend to altitude 2,500 feet. I think that was the point that was being made last week. I'm utterly confident the right thing to say here is 5 miles south of Enstone, currently, good extra word for glider pilots to say, currently, 2,600 feet, 1017. Or if you like, QNH 1017. No need to say altitude.
And do we have to say miles, or do we have to qualify nautical miles?
Let me just think. Well, I'm just thinking what I say. I say miles because everyone knows it's nautical miles. Okay. Again,
Chula, it's Andrew. Since we seem to be doing a brief Q&A, I'll just toss in some of the questions that came up on the channel, if I may. Chris Morris asked, if you get a zone transit, are you able to take a thermal as you transit? And as far as I know, the answer is yes, provided, of course, your clearance doesn't exclude it. But the main point there is we'll talk a lot more about this next week. Don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
No.
No. Okay. Paul K asked, why do you say VFR tracking particularly?
Right. It's not necessary. Okay. It's definitely not necessary. However, if you want to simplify this learning process, when you go through a zone, saying your flight conditions is necessary. So if you want one less thing to remember, I personally find it very forgivable. I think I'm a pedant, okay, but even I would say it's fine to routinely say VFR tracking too.
And I guess a related question is, if you're not VFR, if for instance you're 500 feet from cloud base at 4,000 feet, should you say IFR? Or would that just confuse them?
Well, I'm sure it will confuse them. You obviously don't want to say VFR if it's legally not the case, so I think I would drop it. If you want my degree, okay, there's two things here. Really, try and stick to learning the RT is my overwhelming advice. It's a perfectly legitimate question. My answer to it is I would not say the flight conditions in that state. If I was asked the flight conditions, then the only answer is that you're IMC, but it's really not very helpful. I think control will be confused. I will let Paul come back in on that at the end of my session if you think it's valuable, Paul. Otherwise, I think I'll come. Well, Andrew, I think I'll come back to core, but core includes any more questions, Andrew.
I've got a few actually. James Engelbert, who is a coach, says you need to say altitude so that they know that you're using sea level and not height. But James, I think I disagree. You say, as Chula said, you say altitude if you're changing level so that the word to, TO, doesn't get confused with the word TWO, meaning figure 2. Otherwise, you give them the QNH that you're using, or that QNH is assumed. Jeff Daly asks, can QNH be assumed? And I believe the answer is yes, unless you specify that it's a flight level. You're giving them an altitude QNH, and the only question is what QNH. George Rowden asks in the second part of the message, wouldn't Rissington to Upper Hayford be more useful to ATC and shorten the message? The answer, George, is yes, but the CAA, when we raised them with them on more than one occasion, were very insistent that they wanted the from and the to be your point of takeoff and your point of landing. So even though saying, Gransden Lodge to Gransden Lodge doesn't seem particularly helpful to us. That's what we're supposed to do. Andrew Wood says, is a zone transit request related only to an ATZ, or does it include the CTR? Andrew, as far as I know, the question is for both ATZs and CTRs, you have to ask to enter, but technically, if you're going into controlled airspace, it's a zone transit, whereas if you're going into an ATZ, it's an ATZ penetration. Am I right, Chula?
I would say request across your ATZ or request enter your ATZ to thermal.
Yes, but the word zone applies to controlled airspace rather than ATZ. William Dean raises special VFR. William, let's not talk about special VFR, please. Should we mention, Richard Hanlon asked, should we mention 2 persons on board, etc.? Richard, my answer would be no. Unless you're doing a Mayday, I really wouldn't bother telling them how many people you have on board.
I'm just going to come in on that. It's not in the format, so there's the simple answer. And people like to put it in headings as well. So some people find this really easy. Some people find it really not so easy. I can't understand why people want to make the messages longer or more complicated. So POB is not in there. Neither is heading.
And on we go. I've still got a few more, I'm afraid. Hang on, I'm just going to have to scroll back here. Gosh, everyone's very keen this evening. Paul Ruskin points out that you do need to say altitude. Cat 413 always does. That's interesting because I never hear it on the channel, but that's a very good point. Thank you, Paul.
I was just about to point out that, and it also does include VFR tracking 2 in examples that don't include going through a zone in the Cat 413. I did just check that. I didn't just know that.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are both very interesting points. It has to be said in practice, I never say and rarely hear VFR tracking. And I think most people drop the altitude. But if we're teaching you by the book, we'll do it by the book.
Can I just say something about levels?
Sorry, Simon, give me one. Yeah, Simon, go ahead.
It's just to say that the word level is a generic term for various height, altitude, or flight level. That's why a controller or any ATSU on the ground could ask you, what is your level? And the reason when you come back within altitude, height, or flight level is then that's why you need to use those words beforehand. And you would only give the pressure setting that you're on until you've been given, or they've said that that one's correct by the ATSU.
So, and we've got a few more questions on this point, which I think we've now pretty much covered.
Guys, I'm going to make a process point, which is with 230 people on the call, we really need to feed questions and comments through the chat channel. Otherwise we're dead. So if you could do that, that would be much appreciated. Andrew, back to you.
Yeah, because we do have some duplication on the channel, and it's useful just to be able to focus them all down to one point. I think we've covered the from and to point. A couple of people point out, Chula, you're sounding a little bit muffled. Unfortunately, my experience is you always sound a little bit muffled. I look forward to hearing you in person one day very soon.
Partly the IT, and I assure you I have an ENT appointment. Sorry, it's me.
Oh, well, I'm very sorry to hear that. I hope it does improve. There's also RPS, which people may come across, although I'm not sure if you want to mention that at the moment, as it may confuse things. Neil, I think we're not going to mention it. Reason to use this sort of, yeah, I think we're up to date. Chula, back to you.
Okay. So, thank you. I actually mean it. Thank you for the questions. They're good questions. Special VFR, Andrew rightly breezed over that. It is relevant to know about, but right now we're trying to teach the basics, and that's what you should have written down for your full message. By all means then add currently altitude 2,600 feet. I will say, I hope it doesn't sound defensive because I don't feel it. It's a fact that Cat 413 isn't entirely consistent. I don't know if it is consistent on this point. Whoever spotted that for us, if you find that it is consistent, could you let us know? Could you let Paul know? Because I will change the slide on that basis. Right, 1 second. Right, so the controller then is going to typically come back with a QNH, a service type, e.g. basic service, perhaps a clearance, some permission perhaps, or a restriction, maybe as to level, or any requests and or some questions. So I say again, once you start this dialogue, you've got to be on your mettle, you've got to be listening. And the pilot needs to respond by reading back the required elements, concluding with your guide call sign. So only the required elements. So don't read back more than is called for. So here's a suggestion which covers most of the read back items with the acronym CRAS clearances. So your glider X-ray alpha is cleared to cross the Bryce zone, VFR, direct Little Rissington, say. So that's a clearance. If there's some reference to runway, most obviously cleared to land, runway 03 cleared to land, then it's a runway and it's a clearance. On both counts, you need to read back. If you give the QNH or QFE, conceivably, it's a read back item. Service type. So when you have a dialogue with a controller, really you're setting up a contract. You've asked for something and they're giving you whatever they're giving you back. There are 4 types outside of controlled airspace. In glider land, almost always it's going to be a basic service, but it could be a radar service if you're in a zone. And so it's important, vital, and they won't let you get away with not reading it back and not reading it back correctly. You must read back the service type. And if you're transponder equipped and you're given the squawk 4601, then you need to read back squawk 4601. So there is a slightly longer list in Cat 413, it's not in my head, but CRAS will suffice for most practical purposes, I believe. Common mistakes, I've only got 2, which is first, overusing the ground station call sign. So if all evening long I was to say, Andrew, thanks for the feedback on my mic. For Andrew, that's a lovely jumper. Andrew, your glasses are glinting. It would drive him nuts and everyone else nuts. So only use the person's name or the ground station's name once, and that's at the start of the initial message. You never use it again. And another error is to read back more than you need to. It takes time, but it can be important. Drawing would work well, so let me just try. I'm not going to try and do that right now on the whiteboard, but just try and picture this. If a controller said report south of the center line, and you repeated back report south of the center line, if someone wasn't listening carefully, or you clipped the beginning and the report was missed, say by the drop zone, by the parachute dropping aircraft, they might think you're south of the center line. So if they said report south of the center line, then that's Wilco, followed by your call sign. But the overriding point here is only read back those things that Cat 413 tells you to read back. Andrew, anything else?
Yes, Shula. So we've just got Christina Griffiths reminding us that last week we said that there are circumstances where you have to say hectopascals after the pressure.
Yep.
I regret I can't remember what those circumstances are. Can you?
Under 1,000, so 999 hectopascals.
Thank you. Thanks for clarifying that, and well done, Christina, for flagging it. And Paul K asks, station name repetition. What if there are multiple aerodromes on the same frequency? And Paul, I think the answer is that now that we've got 8.33 kilohertz, part of the reason for doing that was to make sure that provided you're within the approved block of airspace for that ground station, there should be only one ground station that you're talking to, or that's only one ground station that can hear you at that heightened position on that channel. But I'm ready to be corrected.
Safety com.
Yeah, if I could interject there, this is Mike Naylor. Safety com is a frequency that airfields that don't have their own frequency use. And in that situation, you do need to repeat the station name every time. Otherwise, nobody would know who you were talking to.
Yeah.
That's the only case I can think of.
Yeah, actually, Mike, you do raise a good point. There is the related case of using the common glider field frequencies at gliding fields. And I could tell you a story about that, but time is short, so we'll do it another time.
If you look at the screen, Andrew, I know you're finished. Okay. Okay, thanks. So let's just go on to something a bit different. So types of controls in inverted commas, so just notice. So this is what we're just going to cover now. If you look down the left-hand column, air traffic control, aerodrome flight information service, and air-ground communication service. Those are the three types of control. And let's just look at them in a bit more detail. So looking at the top row then, so air traffic control would control, for instance, an aerodrome traffic zone, Class D, for instance, Luton, MATS, for instance, Wittering. Yeah, they could be in Class G, I think. Oh, this is where I will take one from a controller. I think there's Class G possibility, but I can't immediately think of one off the top of my head.
Chula, it's Paul. Yes, you can. You're in the an air traffic zone is in the class of the airspace surrounding it. So Cambridge, for example, is Class G. Ah,
thanks. Couldn't think of it. Call sign suffix. So Wittering, tower. So if you're thinking of Wittering, tower, or Wittering approach, or Wittering radar. In place of Wittering, you could put Heathrow, or London, or I don't know, Glasgow. So the place followed by tower approach radar, that's not meant to be exhaustive. But if you hear those sorts of suffixes, then, whatever the plural of suffixes, then that's air traffic control. And these people can give clearances, instructions, and services. Okay, for instance, in our context, typically a basic service. So an aerodrome flight information service, this is another qualified professional person, and this is a flight information service officer. And their area of responsibility is an airfield up to 10 nautical miles, including the aerodrome traffic zone. By the way, if someone wants to shout at me and tell me Coventry is no longer this, I don't know, it was when I read the slide. So Coventry would be an example. Elstree used to be Elstree Information. I don't know what it is right now, but there's another example. So the suffix there is information. So the important thing here is it's telling you that the class of control is AFIS. And this is important. Because if you go to the last column, they can give you information and a service. But notice, they are not giving you clearances. Yes, I know they can in exceptional circumstances, I know, but in general terms, they're not going to be giving you clearances unless you're on the ground at their airfield. So a FISO can give instructions to taxi, for instance, on the ground, but in general terms, they're not going to give you clearances in the air. You can get it, you may not always, but you can get a basic service out of a FISO. Final row. air ground operator. Again, it's an airfield. So I'll put Shobden here. Now, again, it really doesn't matter what it is today. I'm just trying to teach the idea. So Shobden, when I was last there, which was a long time ago, it was something like, it was one thing Monday to Friday, and it was a different thing at the weekend, depending on the qualification of who they had. So I'm going to invent this, but I think they had a FISO Monday to Friday, and then on the Saturday, Sunday, they didn't have a FISO, so the call sign dropped to Shobden Radio. And notice it's information only, advice only. Again, I know there is a technical exception to that, but it's a simple rule. That's correct. Andrea, are there any questions that have popped up about what I've just been saying or not? Otherwise, I'll carry on.
Yes, we've got a few things that have been raised, some of it harking back to earlier conversations. A couple of people have posted examples of from Cat 413 of things we previously talked about. Thank you very much indeed, although I'm not going to revisit them, but thank you for posting the snippets. William Walker says, if your QNH matches and is confirmed as the station QNH, and I take that to mean you read a QNH, the ground station you're talking to gives you back the same QNH, do you still have to read it back yet one more time? I believe the answer is yes, you do. You always read back the QNH if you're given it. Chris Hanzik says, do you read back a clearance that was denied, if you're not cleared to enter the zone? Chris, we're going to talk a lot more about this kind of thing next week, so if I may, I'll park that until then. Because, as I say, the whole business of getting cleared into controlled airspace is a bigger subject. We'll cover it in a lot more detail next week. Mark Fisher says on Paul's video, he says SSR operating instructions should be read back. What are these? Mark, this is things like squawk codes. And I guess also if you get asked to squawk ident, do you read that back, Chula?
Yes, squawk ident or... Yep. So SSR, secondary surveillance radar, in plain person speak like me, that means transponder. So if they tell you to do something with a transponder, that needs to be read back.
Yeah, thanks. Just a couple more. Mark Davenport, who's a controller, says if you do sometimes repeat the ground station name back when you shouldn't have, don't worry, the sky will not fall in. It's good practice to do it only exactly when you're supposed to, but if you do over repeat a bit, you're not going to get your card marked. And I think we're up to date. Oh, Richard Bills asks, what is Shobden called when it's not Shobden radio, please? And the answer, Richard, is it depends who's at the microphone. If there is a flight information services officer at the microphone and it's licensed, the airfield is licensed to have a FISO, they would call themselves, for instance, Shobden Information.
Great, thanks. So last slide last deliberate input slide anyway, before we go to practice, and this concerns calls to air ground stations. So in your initial message, this is what I suggest you say. You could say something else, but this I think works. So glider X-ray, glider full call sign, Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta. Excuse me. Request airfield information. What's typically going to happen back? So if I say instant radio, glider Golf Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, request airfield information, they're likely to respond with the runway in use, runway 27, right-hand circuit, QNH 1010, circuit's active, something like that. So then you need to read back as this formula here will work for you. Read back as appropriate, in other words, complying with the CRAS rules, so runway and QNH, and then pass pertinent information. 5 miles west, 2,300 feet, next turning point, Bath. So they know where you are, they know in 3 dimensions, and they know where you're going. So that would be my advice for you for calling an air ground station. And Andrew, I'm going to, because we had a lot of questions, Andrew, I'm just going to go ahead for sort of time. I'll give you one more chance to come in. So we've reviewed and practiced the initial call, and we certainly will have practiced them when we're into the groups. We've reinforced the point about if you don't know what to ask for basic service. That's almost certainly the right thing. unless it's an air ground station, in which case ask for airfield information. Readbacks follow the crash rules. It's important that you read back what you have to read back. Don't read back everything just because you can't remember what's in the list. Talked about the 3 levels of controllers. Air traffic control can give clearances and instructions. FISOs, remember the middle one, only can give instructions on the ground. Air ground can only give advice, and I've already recapped the air ground stations point. Next week, we're going to talk a bit more about the different types of control service. Crossing zones, the questions you wanted to ask about tonight. We're going to talk about landing at airfields and a bit more on transponders. Right, let me stop sharing. Anything last from you, Andrew?
Yes, we've just got a couple more points to tidy up. Thanks, Chula. If Shobden has nobody on the mic, you have the option to make calls to Shobden traffic, says Rob Pritchard. So yes, Rob, that's a good point. I think the general point here is that if you are outside the hours of watch of an approach controller or information or an air-to-ground station, then I don't know if it's strictly Cat 413, but yes, you can use the unattended airfield terminology. So just making calls to other traffic. Jeff Daly says, if you plan to land and are given the QNH, do you read back and then ask for the QFE? Jeff, if we may, we'll leave that until we talk about landing specifically at airfields in, I think, 2 weeks' time. Richard Bills asks about call signs, particularly the radio call sign. Can we do that at our site as a non-ATC pilot? Richard, it's a very good point. If you are handling the radio on the ground at your gliding site and you don't hold relevant qualifications, you have to refer to yourself these days as XYZ base. So for instance, at Granston Lodge, it would be Granston Lodge base. In former times, we did sometimes call ourselves, I don't know if it was allowed, we did sometimes call ourselves Granston Radio. That is now strictly verboten. You must refer to yourself as Granston Lodge or whatever base. Alan Langens, is there a convention if your response is delayed and you get talked over, as if you get stepped on? You've just got to wait, Alan, for a gap where you think you're not going to get stepped on and retransmit. If you get stepped on, you have to assume that some or all of your transmission was not received. And Thomas Harris, you mentioned that FISOs are responsible for airspace within 10 nautical miles. Does this mean that you have to call them if transiting within 10 nautical miles, but not through the ATZ? Thomas, no. If you're outside the ATZ, you have no obligation to talk to them. But if you have the time and workload allows, it would be good practice for situational awareness to give them a call for a basic service so they know where you are. But it's not an obligation, just good practice. Paul Rice says, if air-to-ground radio can't give permission, how do you enter the ATZ? Paul, we will talk about this again in a couple of weeks' time. The short answer is you simply have to talk to them, and once you've spoken to them, you have discharged your responsibilities and you can then enter the ATZ if they're an air-to-ground station. If they're approach, then you must get permission before entering the ATZ. And Richard asks, if I have to ask for a say again, it sort of feels that I should repeat what I'm asking. No, I think, Richard, you just either say again, or if it's only part of the transmission, you can say something like, say again or after, and then give the word after which you want the transmission to be repeated. And now I think we're up to date. Thanks, Jula. Lots of questions this evening.
Great. Thank you all for your questions, Andrew. Thank you for dealing with those so efficiently. I hope I was at least R4. Apologies. I can't do anything about it. So enjoy the coaching work. And so you've only got 2 scenarios, and feel free to use those just as much as you like. If the groups are good, then the controller coach can just spice it up a bit and make them more evolved each time as we go as you go around them.
Okay, thank you very much, Tudor. Thank you, Andrew. I've worked out the breakout groups. There is one group, you'll be called the group wait until told before entering. Guess what I want you guys to do?